Good afternoon, everyone. Today we are going to discuss we are going to start a new module H, Economy, Finance, and Trade, and we are going to discuss about the extent of economic globalization, as well as we are going to discuss the currency systems, international currency exchange systems, and importance of stable currencies. So you can find more information in the books I usually recommend you to go with. So Goldstein and Pevenhouse, International Relations, Chapter 9, Global Finance and Business, and Bailey Smith and Owens, Chapter 29, Global Trade and Global Finance. So learning objective H1, evaluate the extent of economic globalization. There are, of course, there are many definitions of globalization. They are not. I would say they are trying to cover different aspects of globalization. In Module A, we spoke about 3 types of globalization: economic, cultural, and political globalization. So basically, in our case, we're going to go in depth with the economic globalization. So economic globalization is a process in which national economies became increasingly integrated and interdependent. You can use another definition of globalization, that of International Monetary Fund. This International Monetary Fund believes that economic globalization includes the growing economic interdependence of countries worldwide through increasing volume of variety of cross-border transactions of goods and services or global trade, as well as international capital flows, and also through more rapid widespread diffusion of technology or technological globalization. Now, some important aspects of globalization which you might take into consideration while discussing including it in your essays. Trade to GDP ratios are rising for most of the countries. Expansion of financial capital flows between the countries, rising foreign direct investment and cross-border money exchanges, rise of global brands, including many from emerging countries, deeper specialization of labor, for example, components from many nations, all right, and global supply chains and new trade investment routes. So what would be some characteristics of globalization? First and foremost, in terms of economic globalization, we are going to notice a greater trade in goods and services, and that is happening both between nations and within regions. An increase in transfer of capital, including the expansion of foreign direct investment by transnational companies and the rising influence of sovereign wealth funds. The development of global brands that serve markets in higher and lower income countries. Spatial division of labor, for example, outsourcing and offshoring of production and support services as a production supply chains became more international. For example, iPhone is part of a complicated global supply chain. The product was conceived and designed in Silicon Valley in US. The software was enhanced by software engineers in India. Most of the iPhones are assembled and manufactured in China and Taiwan by transnationals such as Foxconn. Another characteristic of globalization is the high level of labor migration within and between the states, for example, and then there were new nations which joined the World Trade System. China and India joined WTO in 1991. Russia joined WTO in 2012, and we are going to speak about the World Trade Organization in our next lesson, and you understand thoroughly how exactly does it work and its impact. Basically, Economic globalization led to a fast change and shift in the balance of economic and financial power, where this economic and financial power basically transferred from developed to emerging countries. For example, the change in the center of gravity in world economy, whereby, for example, for now, China, in economic perspective, is raising power. Another characteristic is increasing spending on investment, innovation, infrastructure across large parts of the world, as well as globalization is a process making the world economy more interdependent. Many industrializing countries or developing countries are winning a rising share in world trade, and their economies are growing very fast. And it happens actually faster, and they become in richer developed countries, especially after the global financial crisis. What are the main drivers of globalization or economic globalization? First and foremost, containerization, whereby the cost of ocean shipping, for example, have come down due to containerization, whereby the countries are able to ensure bulk shipping, and this became a lot more efficient. The lower cost of shipping products around the global economy helps to bring prices in the country of manufacture closer to prices in the export market, and makes markets more contestable in international sense. Technological changes also would be the driver of globalization, whereby the reducing costs of transmitting and communicating information basically might represent a key factor behind the trade in knowledge products using web technology. Economies of scale are another driver of globalization, and I'm sure you spoke a lot about it in your economics classes with Ms. Trudy. So many economists believe that there has been an increase in minimum efficient scale associated with particular industries. If this minimum efficient scale is rising, a domestic market may be regarded as too small to satisfy the selling need of these industries, and therefore this pushes the domestic market to internationalize its products. Another driver of economic globalization is the opening up of global financial markets. This has included the removal of capital controls in many countries and facilitated foreign direct investment. Differences in tax system as well. The desire, basically, in this case, the corporations have pushed for it a lot. These desires of corporations to benefit from lower unit labor costs, and basically push them to pledge for to invest more in countries that can ensure this lower prices for labor. Less protectionism, basically in case of economic globalization, the old forms of non-tariff protection, for example, such as import licensing or foreign exchange controls, have been gradually removed. Borders have opened and average tariff levels have fallen. So basically, in this case, the protection is, let's say, we would observe less protectionism. However, we could say that, for example, for U.S. after the elections of Donald Trump, basically, the protectionist measures actually increased, right? And also after the global financial crisis in 2008, this protectionist measures increased as well. We are going to discuss protectionism separately, and we are going to see what are the benefits and what are the disadvantages of protectionism. Okay. Now, for example, if we cannot speak about economic globalization if we're not going to speak about the market-oriented reforms, right? So the market-oriented reform is a factor of economic globalization, and it is considered an institutional driving force of economic globalization. Under the framework of WTO, many countries actually gradually cut down their tariff and non-tariff barriers. More and more countries opened up their current accounts and capital accounts for foreign direct investment, and this actually stimulated the development of trade investment. Okay, so the transition of the former centralized planned economies to market economies had made it truly possible for the world economies to integrate into a world system. Okay. Now, we said that one of the driver and one of the characteristic of economic globalization is the internationalization of trade. So basically, the international trade occurs when one country's citizens produce goods that another country is consumed. So there is consequently a geographical mismatch between the site of production and the site of consumption, which with the goods traveling across at least one national border to connect the producer economically with the customer. The country producing the goods for sale elsewhere in the world is the exporter, right? And the country which produces the goods, which the goods is eventually sold, is the importer, right? So basically, this internationalization of trade, in short, let's say, contributed a lot to the globalization, to economic globalization. Now, we also mentioned in one of our slides that the foreign direct investments were actually promoted a lot by the multinational transnational corporations. And basically, multinationals and transnationals became the main carriers of economic globalization. They are globally organizing production and allocating resources according to the principle of profit maximization. And their global expansions are reshaping macroeconomic mechanisms of the operations of the world economies, right? In order to discuss the multinationals and transnationals, you need to know some differences between them. So basically, multinational companies own a home company and its subsidiaries. Multinational companies have a centralized management system. Multinationals will face a barrier in decision-making due to its centralized management system. On the other hand, the transnationals have no subsidiaries but just many companies who are working under the same brand name, for example. Transnational companies do not have a centralized management system, and therefore each company part of the transnational is able to take their own decision. Transnational companies are able to gain more interest in the local market since they maintain their own system and they are able actually to adapt to the market they are operating in. So another set of differences between MNCs and TNCs: transnational corporations are a type of multinationals. Multinationals have an intentional international identities belonging to a particular home country where they're headquartered. On the other hand, transnationals are more or less borderless. In this regard, they do not consider a particular country as their base. MNCs have branches in other countries, whereas TNCs have subsidiaries. MNCs have investments in other countries, but do not have coordinated product offerings in each country. They're more focused on adapting their products and services to each individual local market. On the other hand, TNCs have invested in foreign operations. They have a central corporate facility but give decision-making, R&D, and marketing powers to each individual foreign market. Okay, so again, this allows them to gain more. So we also mentioned as one of the driver of economic globalization is international finance. Okay, So even though the language and economic image used to describe international trade and international finance are often the same, in practice they actually are quite different. Okay, except for the case of foreign direct investment, it is difficult to think of examples from financial sphere which one country produces money for another to consume. Okay, activity in terms of finance, activity generally takes place in financial markets though taking paper positions using advanced information technology networks, and financial products only very rarely flow across borders in any straightforward import or export sense. Okay, so foreign direct investment as part of the international finance um, would actually include the idea that many countries will actually rely on those foreign direct investments, especially especially those developing and underdeveloped countries, because they will represent the key resource of aggregate demand and also driver of real economic growth. Okay, for example, in 2017, total foreign direct investment was $1.4 trillion globally. Okay, developed countries had an inflow of foreign direct investment of 712 billion dollars and outflows of foreign direct investment of 1,009 billion dollars, and developing countries had an inflow of 670 billion dollars, right? So what would be some strategies of inward investments in terms of foreign direct investment? They actually or let's say, why would the multinational or why would a country invest in another country? There will be attractive rates of corporate taxes, soft loans and tax reliefs, trade and investment agreements, flexible labor markets. The foreign direct investment is also generating special economic zones. Its foreign direct investment is also very critical to build up infrastructure, for example, with ports. Okay. Now, what are some advantages and disadvantages of foreign direct investment? In terms of advantages, foreign direct investment contributes to infrastructure, capital deepening, better training of local workers, and that actually improves the human capital. Foreign direct investment can help the economic growth, and also it helps to increase the export capacity of that particular country. Technology and know-how transfer can help to diversify an economy. More competition in markets, which may actually lead to lower prices and higher real incomes of consumers. It creates new jobs and therefore contributes to increase of per capita incomes and household savings. It lifts the level of factor productivity, which also increases the GNI per capita. On the other hand, foreign direct investments has some disadvantages. It actually contributes to inequality, right? The gains of foreign direct investment are often captured by powerful elites, and the benefits may not flow would not flow to the category needed. Land grabs, extractive FDI, which generates little extra tax revenues for the government. Ethical standards from TNCs may be poor, especially in industries such as mining and textiles. Limited job creation effects, perhaps with a small spillover for some local content suppliers. TNC may normally bring in their own managers and specialists, favoring them over employing local people. So all you have to do here, you have to remember at least 3 of them. Okay. Now, obviously, we now in the past slides, we explain the components of economic globalization, the drivers of economic globalization, and of course, when you are going to use it in your essays, you have to focus in some advantages and disadvantages, right? You don't have to remember them all, but if you remember at least 3 of them, that is going to actually help you a lot in your essays, because that is going to give you that evaluative structure of them. So basically, in terms of benefits, economic globalization encourages producers and consumers to gain benefits from deeper division of labor. Competitive markets reduce the scale of monopoly profits. It actually reduces costs for innovation. It contributes to higher per capita income, reduces the extreme poverty. Freer movement of labor, dynamic efficiency gains from sharing diffusion of ideas, skills, and technologies. Economic globalization helps to contributes to borrowing money in an easy way to help overcome some domestic issues, economic issues. It increases awareness among people around the world of substantial challenges from climate change, wealth, income inequality, and it contributes to governance and better labor protection. In terms of disadvantages, it contributes to greater inequality, and it sometimes contributes to the poverty. This leads to political and social tensions and instability. So basically, it is one of the reasons why do we have failed states, threats the global commons in terms of ecosystems, land degradation, creates macroeconomic fragility in an interconnected world economy. Would actually have will feel any economic shocks in the center of the economic system, as well as in the periphery, the way it happened, for example, in 2008 economic crisis, the way it happens now with the COVID. Okay. Some trading balances in terms of the fact that some countries are going to actually increase their protectionist measures. It leads to higher structural unemployment. It also leads to higher structural unemployment. And in this case, countries where production has shifted to lower cost centers, in case of economic shocks, might actually feel shortages. Okay, standardization, basically. In this case, the giant firms and global brands dominate domestic markets. Dominant global brands were in which dominant brands and superior technologies may squeeze out local producers. And some multinationals might show a very poor behavior in terms of exploitative conditions for low-wage workers, tax avoidance, failure, and environmental issues. So again, as I mentioned before, you need to be able to use this advantages and disadvantages of economic globalization in your essays. It will help you to give that analysis, and it will contribute a lot to your evaluation. So basically, another effect of economic globalization would be the global imbalances, right? So basically, Joseph Stiglitz says that the current process of globalization is generating imbalanced outcomes, both between the countries and within the countries. Okay, so wealth is being created, but too many countries and people are not sharing in its benefits. So basically, it increases the inequality. So in terms of the imbalances between countries, we could notice trade imbalances, current account surpluses and deficits, unbalanced flow of foreign direct investment, where some countries get a lot of foreign direct investment, whereby other countries are not really preferred. preferred as countries where someone could invest, maybe due to political instability or corruption, so on. So imbalances in access to global markets, ideas, health, and education. That, for example, the underdeveloped countries will have a lower level of education and access to R&D and weaker healthcare system rather than the developed countries. Imbalances within the countries basically contributes to rising income and wealth inequality, creating elites which would actually control the most of the wealth, and then the rest of the population would have less access to the wealth. Structural differences in unemployment rates, imbalances between rural and urban areas, whereby the urban areas will be more developed and the rural areas will normally be underdeveloped, with lower access to workplaces and educational systems and healthcare. So up to now we discussed in general terms what would be some components of economic globalization, and we also discussed about financial globalization. Now we have to discuss about the currency system, right, or this aspect of financial globalization as currencies. And we are going to discuss about international currencies and international currency exchanges and importance of stable currencies. So international currency system refers to the system and rules which govern the use of and exchange of money around the world and between the countries. Each country has its own currency as money, and the international monetary system governs the rule for valuing and exchanging these currencies. What is an international currency? There are certain characteristics and certain functions a currency has to fulfill to be considered an international one. So a medium of exchange, unit of account, and store value in an international context. In terms of means of exchange, basically without money we would have to exchange goods and services direct for other goods and services. That is to engage in barter. Money which is accepted by everyone simplifies trade. So basically the international currency would be actually accepted by everyone, okay, and would actually make the trade a lot easier, because this international currency would serve as an exchange value, right? A unit of account, money enables us to compare the value of different goods and services. It is the standard used to express their prices. Money also make it possible to compare costs, incomes, and profits over time. It is therefore the basis of accounting, a system which enables us to plan and take economic decisions. And store value, money is used to accumulate savings. Money is the liquid reserve capable of being converted easily and quickly into any type of good service. Okay, so some theories of currency internationalization. According to Hellener and Kirchner, the literature and currency internationalization can be classified into three strands. The market-based approach highlights three major determinants of currency internationalization: confidence, liquidity, and transaction networks. Within this, standard currency internationalization is mainly the product of decentralized decisions of the private sector. I'm sure you have discussed this during your economics classes. And a second stand would be the instrumental one, which stresses a currency is understood to depend on two factors. First, the willingness of central banks to use state currency as an exchange rate, anchor on and foreign exchange reserves, allocation decisions, and the second, the willingness of home country to open up its financial system to non-residents and to allow free capital mobility both inwards and outwards. So basically, the instrumental approach would emphasize on those foreign direct investment, or how the home countries actually would be ready to accept any other countries coming in with their investment in their domestic market. Okay. And the geopolitical approach relates currency internationalization to the international order in three approaches to be combined. So basically, the geopolitical approach combines the instrumental market approach. Here we will focus mainly on a market-based trend, in basically on how exactly markets from certain regions are actually interconnected, and what exactly pushes certain countries to create some regional agreements, or to create trade agreements, or to accept a certain currency for their own region. For example, European Union has its own currency. Now, if we're talking about evolution of international currency system, it has been a long time, a long process. Basically, until the 19th century, the major global economies were regionally focused in Europe, Americas, China, and India. These were quite loosely linked, and there was no formal monetary system governing their interactions. Okay. The pre-World War monetary system would include the idea that in ancient societies, the gold was used as a mean of economic exchange, and step by step more countries adopted gold, usually in form of coins or bullion, and this international monetary system became known as a gold standard. Okay, the gold standard in its essence actually create fixed exchange rate system, and we are going to discuss it a little bit later. An exchange rate is the price of one currency in terms of a second currency. In gold standard system, each country sets the price of its currency to gold, specifically to 1 ounce of gold. Okay. A fixed exchange rate stabilizes the value of one currency vis-a-vis another, and makes trade and investment easier. And some advantages and disadvantages of fixed exchange rates would be that an advantage would be that avoids currency fluctuations, encourages firms to invest, in incentive to keep inflation low, avoids devaluation. Disadvantages might lead to conflicts with other macro objectives. It's not flexible, creates current account imbalance, and may require higher interest rates. So basically, it depends on how much gold one country has to determine its wealth. In 1821, UK was the predominant global economy through the because of its extent of its economic empire, and it also adopted the gold standard and committed to fix this gold standard to the value of British pound. Okay, so major trading countries including Russia, Austria-Hungary, Germany, France, and United States also follow the fixed price of their currencies to an ounce of gold. The United Kingdom officially set the price of its currency by agreeing to buy or sell an ounce of gold for a price of 4.2 pounds sterling. At that time, US agreed to buy and sell an ounce of gold for $20. This enabled the two currencies to be freely exchanged in terms of an ounce of gold. So what would be some advantages of gold standard? It reduced the risk in exchange rate because it established fixed exchange rates between countries. Countries were forced to observe strict monetary policies. They could not just print money to combat economic downturns. Global standard would help country correct its trading balances. For example, if a country was importing more than it's exporting, then under the gold standard, the country had to pay for the imports with gold. Okay. However, after the World War I, the gold standard collapsed. During the gold standard, countries could not expand their money supply beyond what was allowed by the gold reserves held in. So basically, during the war, both sides had to finance their huge military expenses and did so by printing money, printing more paper currency. As the currency in circulation exceeded each country's gold reserves, many countries were forced to abandon the gold standard. So in 20s, most countries, including UK, US, Russia, France, returned to the gold standard at the same price level despite the political instability, high unemployment, inflation that were spread throughout Europe. And the gold standard actually limited a lot of flexibility of the monetary policies of each country, central banks, by limiting their ability to expand their money supply. After World War II, the international community has set up the Bretton Woods system, and we're going to discuss it in our next lesson. And in part of the Bretton Woods system, a new monetary system was established based on the US dollar. This system incorporated some of the disciplinary advantages of a gold system, while giving countries the flexibility they needed to manage temporary economic setbacks, which had led to the fall of a gold standard. The Bretton Woods system lasted until 1971 and provided the longest formal mechanism for an exchange rate system and forums of countries to cooperate on coordinating some policies and so on. So the Bretton Woods system agreement lasted until 1971, as I mentioned before, and it had several key features, right? One of them is fixed exchange rates or pegged rates, and that was one of the critical factors that led to the fall of a gold standard. Was after the United Kingdom abandoned its commitment to maintaining the value of British pound, countries had to peg their currencies to US dollar. With the strength of US economy, the gold supply in the United States increased, while many countries had less gold in reserve than they did currency in circulation. So at the end, the agreement established that only governments rather than anyone who demanded it out could convert US dollars holdings into gold, which was a major improvement over the gold standard. Another feature of Bretton Woods system was the national flexibility, which actually allowed countries to manage temporary but serious downturns. The Bretton Woods Agreement provided a devaluation of currency more than 10% if needed. So countries could not use this tool to competitively manipulate imports and exports. Rather than, this tool was intended to prevent the large-scale economic crisis like the one which was in 30s since. So if we're talking about pros and cons of fixed exchange rates, some advantages is stability given to the peg is peg is credible, low interest rates, clear and easy understanding of nominal anchor, moderation of inflationary expectations, susceptibility to currency crisis, if any occur, requires a high level of international reserves. It's another disadvantage. A low ability to absorb shocks, which are instead passed to the real sector of economy. Part of the Bretton Woods system was the creation of International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, and we are going to discuss this thoroughly in our next session as well. At first, the main point of International Monetary Fund was to help manage the fixed rate exchange system. It eventually evolved to help governments correct temporary trade imbalances. The Bank's purpose was to help with post-war World War II European reconstruction. Both institutions continue to serve these roles, but have evolved into broader institutions. And now they actually kind of serve some global purposes rather than they serve some regional ones. In order to face any instabilities, the international system has to develop reserve currencies. So a reserve currency is the main currency that many countries and institutions hold as part of their foreign exchange reserves. Reserve currencies contribute are often international pricing currencies for wealth products and services. For example, the current reserve currencies are US dollars, British pound, Swiss franc, and Japanese yen. After the collapse of Bretton Woods system in 1971, monetary system faced transition from fixed exchange rates to floating exchange rates. Floating exchange rates have facilitated an adjustment to external shocks ever. So in 1976, countries met to formalize a floating exchange rate system, and they signed Jamaica agreements in which currencies float against one another, with governments intervening only to stabilize their currencies at set target exchange rates. So this in contrast to completely free floating exchange system, which has no government intervention. So the Jamaica Agreement also removed gold as a primary reserve asset of the International Monetary Fund. Additionally, the purpose of International Monetary Fund was expanded to include lending money as a last resort to continue their imbalance of payment challenges. The most noteworthy regional effort resulted in the European monetary system and the creation of single currency, the euro. While there have been no completely effective efforts to replace Bretton Woods system, on a global level there have been efforts to have provided ongoing exchange rate mechanisms. So if we're talking about the advantages and disadvantages of floating exchange rate systems, basically from advantages, it supports effectively by adhering free market ideology, by allowing in undisturbed supply and demand, no need for active management from international bodies like International Monetary Fund or central banks of the countries to intervene. In the long run, it displays the macroeconomic performance value of the currency's nation through price discovery. On the other hand, it has a disadvantage such as high volatility. This means that rates can appreciate and depreciate in large fluctuations. This may disrupt a stable value of exchange, for example. It also tends to worsen existing problems. Floating exchange rates may worsen existing problems such as inflation. It might increase it. And if there is high inflation, and cheap currency may have even more inflation. Okay. Now, of course, we can speak about some such phenomena as dollarization, and in this case, we're talking about the advantages and disadvantages of using dollar as a currency, as an international currency. So, the advantages of the dollarization is the decrease in nominal interest rates. It removes the probability of currency crisis, as dollar is quite a strong currency. Decreases transaction costs, no surprises from economic entities. On the other hand, some disadvantages would be exit strategy from would be quite costly. Existence of possible asymmetric shocks, like it happened in 2008. External shocks can all be absorbed by real economic activity, no longer fast resort facilities, and so on.